All right, welcome back, critical thinkers. So we're going to start our discussion of the media and how the media influences perception and the media influences our attitudes, because a good critical thinker recognizes that their attitudes, your perceptions, your beliefs are in very fundamental ways shaped by the culture that you grow up within. And in the modern age, the culture is heavily influenced by the media. So we're going to start out by talking about the mass media, things like television and books and movies, newspapers, online newspapers, magazines, online magazines, the mass media, and then we'll have a discussion of social media, because we're influenced by the images that we see every day. And so we just need to sort of explore how our perceptions and attitudes are shaped by this incredibly powerful mode of information. So make sure that you have the lecture titled Media 1, or The Power of the Media. Right, so the first thing I want to talk about is what is mass media. So mass media is been around for, I guess, as long as there's been a printing press, right? This idea that there's some central source, right, that communicates information to a wide variety of people. So the mode of communication is very one way, coming from a central source like a television or a movie studio or a publishing house, and then going out to the masses, mass media. And it still exists, right? Even in the internet age and even in the social media age, mass media still exists. And it still shapes attitudes and shapes values in the Western world and everywhere else where there's mass media. And so slide 2 sort of gets at why we have to consider the mass media, right? And we have to consider the mass media because when we ask people about whether or not media impacts other people, 72% of people say, oh yes, absolutely. Of course the media and TV affects people. How could it not? But then, so almost everyone, well, or at least the lion's share of people believe that the mass media affects others. But when asked about themselves, only 22% of people are willing to admit that their attitudes and their opinions are being shaped by the media. And both of these things cannot be true. It can't be true for everyone that other people are affected, but not me. Do you see that imbalance there? And it's also important to recognize, so essentially people are in denial, right? People are in denial that they are being influenced by the media, right? And this becomes hugely problematic because if you're in denial about the fact that something affects you, you can't be on guard against it, right? And because research studies make it very clear, the extent to which somebody is willing to admit their biases, admit their shortcomings, the more likely they're able to overcome them. It's the person who says the media doesn't affect me who is the most likely to be affected by the media. Whereas someone willing to say, yes, absolutely, television and the mass media affects me, but that's okay, I know it affects me, and so I'm going to take into account that influence when I make my decisions. It's that person who is actually less affected by the media, right? So it's this counterintuitive idea. And the big problem is most people are unwilling to admit that television and the mass media affects them personally, right? And so there are some thought questions I want you to have, right? Because what I'm going to be showing you is some images from the mass media. And these are, on slide 3, are just some questions I want you to keep in mind as we're having this discussion. Because I'm going to use gender as a working example of how the mass media shapes our ideas. You could do a whole career just on the mass media and on how it shapes thinking. But we're just going to scratch the surface in this critical thinking class. So I want to talk about gender, talk about how the mass media shapes gender, not because gender is the only thing shaped and molded by our culture, but it's just a big one. It's a big one that affects everyone, because everyone has a gender, whether you're male, female, or gender fluid, or mark the other box. It doesn't matter. Everyone has some sort of societally, culturally driven gender, and so I think it's important to explore this. I think it's useful to explore this topic when we think about how the media shapes our ideas. Right? So here are some just thought questions to have, right? Do you watch television? Do you listen to the radio? Do you consume mass media? Right? How do you think advertisements shape your thinking, shape your beliefs and attitudes, right? Does advertising alter what you buy, right? Does it not? How are you able to resist it if it doesn't? Does the media shape our ideas of womanhood and our ideas of manhood? Does it shape our ideas of masculinity and femininity, and who is allowed to be masculine versus feminine, right? Do men and women have different expectations in our culture of their behavior? Are these naturally inborn, or are they really heavily influenced by our culture, right? So think about these things as we're having this discussion. My lecture on this sort of discussion of gender and the mass media is going to be relatively short, because then I'm going to have you watch a video called Killing Us Softly 4. Not because I agree with everything that the maker of this video has to say, but I think it's just a useful point of view to consider. It's a useful take on gender and the media, and how mass media and advertising in particular shapes our ideas of men and women, and what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, what it means to be good and bad, and what it means to be normal in terms of society and our expectations of men and women. And if nothing else, it's an excellent video to give you a slew, just a ton of examples of the mass media, from the mass media advertising of men and women. And even if you don't buy into every single conclusion that the speaker herself buys into, I think you can draw your own conclusions about men and women and how they're portrayed, and how that might shape our thinking about gender from just the images that she shows. And after you've watched that video, we'll have another discussion of the media in the next video, and I'll give you my own point of view on her thoughts. But first, I'm just going to give you a primer, some basics of how gender is portrayed in the media, or how it has been historically, and how there are gender differences. There are differences, and then watch the video Killing Us Softly 4, and then I'll return to that discussion in my next video, which is another discussion of the mass media. All right, so slide 4. One of the things that is a gendered topic is this idea of beauty. Now, a lot of what is beautiful is biological, right? There are a lot of cross-cultural similarities in terms of beauty that you can track as a biological psychologist or a anthropologist. There are things that signal fertility, right? Things like youth. Youth is universally considered beautiful. A small jawline in women is a marker of fertility and is universally considered beautiful. Wide set eyes are often are cross-cultural signal, again, of evolutionary health, right? There's a bunch of things that are signals for fertility that are cross-cultural. But some aspects of beauty, particularly beauty as it pertains to women, are really, really seated in the culture. And you don't see cross-cultural standards necessarily. So, for example, how thin a woman is supposed to be versus heavier, right? This is something that's not going to be generally a biological, cross-cultural standard of beauty. Different cultures actually have different standards of how much a woman is supposed to weigh, or how big she's supposed to be in terms of beauty. As an example, in 1957, Miss America was 5'7", which is about 3 inches taller than average. So taller, because actually being tall is a cross-cultural, meaning biological trait. Taller women or taller people actually are generally considered more attractive. And so 5'7", the fact that she's a little taller than average, is not a huge shock. But she weighed about 150 pounds, which is, if you use, just sort of on average, 150 pounds is actually a healthy weight for a woman who is 5'7", on average. But when you look today, the average Miss America, although she is still 5'7", revealing sort of the stableness of taller people are considered somewhat more attractive than more shorter or diminutive folk. But nowadays, Miss America weighs 121 pounds, which is underweight for a woman who is 5'7". It's not a lot underweight, right? There's a healthy range for different heights, on average. And 121 pounds, though, is just a little underweight, right? Although some women can be 5'7" and 120 pounds and be perfectly healthy, for many women that is that is underweight, right? A little too slender on average for optimal health. And so you can see that there is a changing standard of beauty. At least there was from 1957 to 2011, which was when this particular study was done, looking at the average weight of Miss America, right? So, and the pendulum can switch the other way as well, right? And my point is that the media helps shape what we consider beautiful. And for good or for bad, physical beauty is something that we as a culture hold in high esteem. Beautiful people are considered more intelligent. Beautiful people are considered more sociable. They're considered more moral. And all of these are sort of unconscious connections that we make. It's called the halo effect. Beautiful people have an advantage. There's a privilege to being pretty. And because of that, looking at how culture shapes how we think of ourselves in terms of physical beauty, I think is an important conversation, given how much time and money and resources that we throw at being beautiful. The fact that a lot of what we consider beautiful is simply cultural, and how there can be a toxic definition of beauty that is really problematic in a society that values physical beauty so much. It's problematic that physical beauty is valued so much, but it becomes even more problematic when that culturally driven definition of beauty becomes a toxic definition. So slide 5. This is Camille Clifford and Gladys Cooper, called the first supermodels by people who study the history of fashion. And if you look at them, you can see, if you look at just their faces, you see that these are conventionally attractive women, even by today's standards. These are pretty faces, but their bodies are very different. How they're dressed, but these bodies were actually considered the ideal in 1900, right? And so you can see these very sort of different standards of beauty. Moving to 1910, this is Theda Bara. You see the body type has changed in 1910. Still a very pretty face, but again, the body has shifted. Here we have Betty Grable in the 1930s. Betty Grable's legs were insured in the 30s for like $1 million, because she was considered to have the best, most beautiful legs, period. These legs were considered perfect legs. Compare that to nowadays, where girls are starving themselves to have thigh gaps. You can see how the standard of what was considered perfect. She wasn't just considered attractive. These legs were considered perfect in 1930, right? So a shifting standard of beauty. We've got the 1950s and 60s. You have Marilyn Monroe, very curvaceous, standard of beauty. And then as you move into the 60s, you have sort of fashion taking over our standards of beauty, where the standard of beauty became much thinner. And this is Twiggy. She was a model in the 60s. where you had an increasingly thin standard of what it meant to be beautiful. Where as you moved from the 50s into the 60s. And again, if you look at these faces, the faces of these women have a similar symmetry, have a similar small jawline, wide eyes, big smile. Some things are not culture. Some things that are beautiful are not cultural. But look at how the bodies have changed, right? The bodies have shifted and changed in terms of what is beautiful and what is ideal. And as you move into the 70s and 80s, you have Farrah Fawcett. The standard of beauty is now not just for models, but for actresses and other sort of women to be thinner and thinner by the 70s. And then the 80s, you sort of saw a standard of beauty shift not only to thin, but also more athletic, right? Into the 90s. Where again, you had sort of heroin chic was the way they described Kate Moss. So very, very thin, wayfish. Wayfish where no muscle tone at all for some models versus like a Cindy Crawford where you have again that very sort of the athletic model of beauty. Going into the 2000s where that sort of wayfish standard of beauty had sort of gone away. And now you have the hyper-toned, hyper-athletic, very, very ripped, built standard for not only models like Victoria's Secret models, Giselle, but also for pop stars. And so for actresses where the model for everyone is to not only be thin, have no fat on your body, but also be incredibly toned, right? And if you think about the present, moving into the present, we sort of see a shift back. I think we see a shift back with Kim Kardashian and more curvaceous models now getting more airtime. But this has been a recent trend. If you look from really since the 2010s, have you seen more of a curvaceous standard of beauty becoming more and more acceptable? But this is very recent, and I would suspect part of the reasons why you see this sort of resurgence of curvy standards of beauty is, well, fashion goes back and forth, but also you've had movements. You have movements that have resulted from advocacy that comes from videos much like the one you're about to watch. That one was actually, the one you're about to watch called Killing Us Softly 4 is actually from 2010, so a little bit outdated. And I think, but that kind of video and that kind of discussion, the discussion of toxic definitions of beauty, I think is part of the reason why you see sort of body positive movements and a rejection among many women of this sort of impossible ideal of hyper thin beauty. And so I think that as we watch this video, Killing Us Softly 4, I really think the pushback against that and how in the last 5 or 6 years we've seen more and more women be considered idyllic and beautiful and curvaceous, Beyonce and Kim Kardashian and others like that. I think it's been successful. I think it's an example of successful advocacy changing media landscape. But still, my point remains that the media shapes our thinking about what is beautiful, and there's still many aspects of beauty that remain toxic coming from the media. We don't have quite as hyper thin and so athletic you'd lose your period definitions of beauty anymore, or at least we're moving away from that as the standard, which I think is successful advocacy. So I'll count that as a win, at least in some regards, right? And although all the examples, so moving on to slide 12, even though all the examples I've given so far are about sort of how we define beauty, and because and for women, that doesn't mean that the media doesn't shape our ideas about men, right? That doesn't mean that. But the reason why I focus on beauty standards for women is because in our culture, research makes it pretty clear that women are often evaluated first and foremost by how they look, whereas men are often evaluated first and foremost by how they behave or what they do, their jobs. And so you have this sort of difference in society with how men and women are evaluated. And so if you look at how the media shapes our ideas of femininity, it's often about the way a woman looks and how she is permitted to look in order to be valued. Whereas men are evaluated and judged to just as much, but less about how they look and more about how they behave and their jobs and whether or not they're masculine enough, right? So in a very real way, women are treated as objects, literally objects, not people, but objects, where men are turned into aggressors, right? Men are turned into violent, aggressive people in the media. And so when they do media studies, or they look at movies and television, by and large, men and boys are angry. They're violent. At least that's how they solve problems. And the protagonists, meaning the heroes of the shows that we see with men are not expressing the full range of human emotions. They often will simply express anger or happiness, but they can only be happy under certain circumstances. They're not allowed to express grief or fear in the way that women are permitted to express their emotions. And when I say permitted, women are shown displaying the full range of human emotions, but then of course judged for being too emotional. Whereas men are not shown as having those full range of human emotions, or if he is, then he is always the butt of the joke, right? A man who is afraid or shows natural fear is usually the butt of a joke, or a man who shows sensitivity or compassion is often the butt of the joke. It's called the gender straitjacket of male emotions. And so we have both men and women portrayed in very stereotypical ways in the media, where women are just essentially objects and men are seen as violent aggressors, right? And so you end up with these stereotypical visions of men and women, which then we all use to compare our own behavior to, right? Where men don't want to seem like they're ever afraid, and men don't want to seem compassionate, because that's not what a man does, right? That's not what a good man does, right? So moving on to slide 13, just think about how men are portrayed in the media and how unfair it is. How unfair it is that the only visions we see of heroic men are angry men who are violent. And men who are sensitive or caring are almost always ridiculed, right? Or they're stuck in romantic comedies where his sensitivity, his feminine side, is belittled and judged, as if that's not like a totally acceptable, normal way for a man to behave. We know from neuropsychological evidence that men and women have the exact same emotional responses. There's these thing called micro movements, even in the face, because there are these facial expressions that we are sort of biologically wired to have when we're scared or happy or angry. And men and women respond in almost identical ways emotionally, which they can track with these microfacial expressions when they watch movies or when they have something happen to them, right? You can document it. The difference is men are masking these emotions. They're choosing not to express them, because in our society it's not socially acceptable for men to display those full range of emotional experiences. And that sucks, right? That just sucks. It sucks for men, right? And going back a little bit to my argument that women are viewed as objects, there's actually good neuropsychological evidence to support that idea too. When we're actually making visual assessments of people or visual assessments of objects, there's different parts of the brain that are actually responsible for like facial recognition when we're looking at people versus object recognition when we're looking at like apples and oranges and cars and stuff. And what's fascinating is that when women are, when both men and women, so when people look at images of women from the media, the part of the brain that's supposed to regulate people recognition doesn't activate as much as the part of the brain that is responsible for object recognition. So it's almost as if our brain recognizes that women used in media campaigns aren't people. They're just objects. Because we're actually looking at women in these media advertising campaigns as objects. Literally, our brains are coding them as objects, and that's the part of the brain that activates the most, right? So the evidence is pretty overwhelming that the media shapes how we think, and our culture shapes how we think about what it means to be a good man versus a good woman. Not that there aren't biological differences between men and women, but so much of it is cultural. And if we want to make good critical thinking decisions about ourselves as men, as women, or as other, because a non-trivial number of people fall into an other camp biologically. I mean, less than 1 in 1,000, right? More than 1 in 1,000. There are millions of people that are not biologically one or the other. And you can email me or post in the forum if you're interested in being biologically intersexed, which is much more common than we recognize. But either way, whether you're a man or woman or other, in some capacity intersexed, there are cultural images that shape how you evaluate yourself as a man or a woman, and then how you evaluate yourself and your worth in that regard. And in fact, I would probably argue that it's just getting worse for men. Like, not only do you have the straitjacket of male emotions, but now men have these impossible ideals too, right? Men have these impossible standards they have to that they're held up to. So not only do men have to be masculine and strong and stoic and not be afraid and not show compassion, now they have to be ripped too. So it's just getting worse. Like, look at even Ken, the next slide. Ken in 1950 compared to Ken now. I mean, Ken's been working out. I mean, I just think the media nowadays really pushes these sort of very, really hard to achieve ideals about what is good and acceptable in terms of physical beauty, right? Maybe with women it's no longer a super thin standard, but it's still a standard that's pretty hard to achieve. And sort of the last thing I want to share with you before I want you to go off and watch this video is I don't want you to get the sense, so we're on the next slide after Ken. I don't want you to get the sense that that I'm trying to like pit men against women, right? That it just sucks to be a woman and it's just sort of totally righteous to be a man. But I do want to make the strong argument that it's different. That to be a woman in society and to be a man in society is very different. And women are first and foremost evaluated by how we look, whereas men are evaluated by how they behave. And how somebody looks is sort of the least important part of a person, right? Because you have very little control over how you look. I mean, yes, you could exercise. Yes, you could diet, although diets don't work. You could, I guess, theoretically have plastic surgery, or you could pile the makeup on, so pay a bunch of money to look better, right? But if you don't want to spend a ton of money and you just want to live your life, evaluating someone based on how they look just kind of sucks, because people don't get to choose their genes, right? And so the fact that women, so much more than men, are being evaluated by how they look is an additional burden. It's a burden to being a woman. So I just want to give you some evidence, because I don't want you to just take my word for it, right? I want to give you some evidence that in our society, women are evaluated first and foremost by how they look, whereas men are evaluated by the things that they do, which is much more under their control than how a woman looks. So here's a study where they took 521 magazine covers, all with people on them, right? And they broke them down by gender, right? And then, in addition, they broke it down by whether or not this person on the magazine cover was simply there to be looked at, right? Or whether or not the person on the cover of that magazine was there because they had accomplished something, or they were showing an activity, doing something. And here's what they found on the next slide. So of these 521 magazine covers, 291 of them The person on the cover was just there to be looked at. That was the only reason they were there. Look at this beautiful person. Isn't she beautiful? Look at this beautiful person. Isn't he beautiful? 85% of the being looked at magazine covers were women, right? If you want to have somebody on a magazine cover to be a symbol of beauty, and then it's got to be a woman, right? When a woman was on a magazine cover, she was most likely there to simply be looked at. Versus the doing things magazines, right? On the cover of the magazines because somebody was doing something, had accomplished something, or just to illustrate an activity. Most of the magazine covers where someone was doing something had a man on the cover, right? So if you want to show somebody, if you're a woman and you're on a magazine cover, you're likely to be an object of beauty, and that's all you are. That's the only reason you're on the cover, is you are a beautiful person. However, if you're a man and you're on a magazine cover, you're much more likely to be displayed as doing something, right? So women are objects, whereas men are defined by the things that they do. And most of the time, the things that they do are violent and stoic, meaning no emotional expression, right? Just one example of the countless studies that show that women are first and foremost evaluated by beauty, which is often an impossible beauty standard to attain, whereas men are evaluated by what they do. And we have a narrow definition of what it means to be properly feminine in our society, and a narrow definition of what it means to be properly masculine in our society, right? So, as you watch Jean Kilbourne's Killing Us Softly 4, which is the link to that is on the Moodle page, just as the link to this video lecture is on the Moodle page. As you watch Killing Us Softly 4, keep in mind it is from 2010, and much of the things that she has seen, there have been improvement. To be quite frank, media studies do show some improvement in terms of the thin standard of beauty that she describes. Right? This not that we don't still value thinness. Right? That is still totally a thing. It's just not quite as unhealthy as it used to be. At least I would argue that there has been some, not enough, but some shift back to a more realistic body, body size for women. It's not like heroin chic, waif thin anymore. But still, thin is in, and that pendulum swing could swing back to that hyper thin standard of beauty. But the other points that she makes in the talk, she makes points about how we view masculinity, and I think those are still very relevant. She makes points about the sexualization of femininity, which I think is still incredibly relevant. She makes the point about an impossible standard of beauty, right? The use of Photoshop to create these impossibly beautiful women. Those are still very, very relevant. So although I do think since this video was made, there has been modest gains in sort of, body type positivity, really through advocacy. Almost all of her other points, I think, are pretty well supported. And I'll talk more about my views, which are just my views. Take this video as a point of view. Take Killing Us Softly 4 as simply a point of view I'm presenting you with, that I want you to be familiar with. Just as food for thought about how the media shapes our attitudes, and gender is just one working example of how the media shapes our attitudes. So at this point, go watch Killing Us Softly 4 with Jean Kilbourne. And I'll see you next time when we'll talk more about the media.